Welcome to Stroke Forward. My name is Marcia Moran. For the next 40 minutes or so, we are going to talk about things that stroke survivors, or any brain injury survivor, deals with. If you look at me today, you probably don't see a person who had a stroke, but I feel it. My body functions differently. Do I think I will get back to 100%? Yes, because to think differently is to admit defeat. We will talk to all sorts of people who have been there, from survivors to caretakers to doctors, nurses, therapists, friends, and family who have seen us at our weakest. They have cheered us with their victories, no matter how large or how small. How did we get here? That's what this show is going to tell you. Simon Barton was born and raised about 15 miles southwest of London, England, in 1960. He studied and practiced mechanical engineering design before moving to North Carolina with his wife, Sarah, and their 3 children in 1994. At the time of his stroke in 2013, he owned and managed his design and applications engineering business in the Triangle Park area in North Carolina, where he still lives today. With the closure of his business in 2015, he took to writing and publishing. He has 2 books out right now, Not So Green as Cabbage Looking, and Bad Rhymes, No Reason. I'm delighted to introduce Simon Barton. How are you doing today, Simon?
I'm doing just tickety-boo, thank you, Marcia.
Tell me about the day you had your stroke.
Well, it was a busy day. I had my own little business. It was just a small business, engineering design consultancy company in the machine tool industry. And I had about 12 engineers, design engineers, and myself. I also design engineered myself, as well as being the president and CEO of the company. And it was a Tuesday. The previous evening, I was working late at home because I was preparing for a wedding that was coming up the following weekend, which was my eldest son was getting married, and the reception was going to be at the house. So I was doing my best to get the yard ready and all that stuff. And I remember getting a little bit exhausted and out of breath, but not thinking anything of it at the time. But on the morning of the well, I can't remember the date now, the 16th of May, I think it was, of 2013, I went back into the office as usual at about 5 or 6 o'clock in the morning, normal morning, and I had an appointment to make a phone call with a bank that I was borrowing money from, Bank of America, as it happens, a lady called Deborah, and she needed to conduct this interview, a phone interview, to approve some money that I was looking to borrow. And in the process was asking me my name and my date of birth. And because I'm an Englishman at birth, we say our dates the other way around to Americans. And I remember getting confused when I was saying my birthday being the 8th of July, 1960. And I kept correcting myself, saying, oh, in your language, that is 7/8/1960, not 8/7/60, which is what I was trying to say. And not realizing at the time, as I was getting confused, that it's probably me just slurring and going through that phase, because that was the last thing I remember saying at the time. And now that I've become a little bit more accustomed with stroke and what happens during the process, I think I was actually right in the middle of that process right there. But of course, I just carried on like normal. And then the next thing I remember, I was on the floor. I somehow fainted and collapsed on the floor of my office. But fortunately for me, my secretary first of all found me, Hannah, and she called Bill, who was an engineer that previously was a paramedic. He recognized the signs immediately when he asked me questions and asked me to do things that I couldn't do, like lift my left arm and all that stuff, and recognized the signs immediately and called 911. And I was gurneyed into an ambulance and rushed off to a local hospital where, fortunately, again, they had just recently set up a stroke emergency program, identified that I had an ischemic stroke, a blood clot to the brain, and administered this TPA drug to bust the clot, I think they call it, and then a series of MRIs and scans after that had me in ICU for the next few days before being eventually transferred over to Rehab. When my brain had stopped swelling, apparently, I was able to be transferred over to a rehab hospital where I spent the next 3 or 4 weeks.
What was rehab like?
Well, a distant memory now, but at the time, I was in denial. First of all, I'd never had a stroke before. I didn't know anybody that had a stroke. Except maybe Winston Churchill, I'd heard, one of my heroes, because I know he died of a stroke. I didn't know what were the causes and what was the process. I certainly didn't know the symptoms and the loss of my left side in my case, my problems with thinking, my constant sleeping. I was asleep pretty much the whole time, just being woken up various times during the day to either use the bathroom or use the I wasn't allowed out of the bed, so I was given a device to be able to pee in bed and all that stuff. And then they get a Hoya, which was a crane that would lift me out of the bed into a chair, and then I'd be wheeled to PT, physical therapy, at some point in the day. I'd be wheeled to occupational therapy at some point in the day, and I'd be wheeled to speech therapy at some time in the day. Probably like every other stroke survivor, we go through these 3 therapies in hospital in my case, for the next 3 or 4 weeks, about 3 or 4 times a day, one equal for each.
Yeah. You lost your filters. I guess I
was told. I had no idea what the SLP was telling me at the time. She made a quite big song and dance of it. She said, "Now, Simon, I need to warn you." And I said, "Oh, what about what, Karen?" And she said, I think you have probably lost all your filters. So be very careful what you stop, think, and be careful what you say," she said. That's what she told me then. Of course, she was absolutely true. And because she told me that, I have flaunted that, because now it gives me a medical excuse to be rude. Because I was a bit direct in the first place. I was a boss, a fairly extrovert, and like to think myself as a witty, cheeky sort of guy. And now I've got this condition that I can now use so I can be rude to you, Marcia, and then say sorry afterwards. It's not me being deliberately rude. It's this condition that I've got as a result of a stroke, of a brain injury.
Okay.
Shocking.
What did your family feel about the cheekiness after your stroke?
I think they were. I think they sort of gradually got used to it, I think.
Okay.
My wife always said I had a bit of a sense of humor in the first place before the stroke, and was reasonably filterless before the stroke. And I think she said to her in an interview recently, she said to somebody that it's why I married him.
Okay.
She said. So
it's a good thing that you still have cheekiness then.
Yeah, I guess so.
I've heard that you've used book writing. Why did you need to turn your life around? And how did the book writing help you?
Well, I think it started more by accident. It wasn't like I set out to write a book. Goodness, no. I'd never written a book before. But I'd been writing most of my life, obviously with my job as a design engineer, research design engineer especially, and developing a number of new technologies. I was obliged to write papers for conferences and lecture at conferences about this new technology that I had developed and patented. And so I'd written lots of technical papers. So I knew how to speak and write in the English language. So that wasn't so daunting. But fortunately for me, my first SLP, outpatient SLP, Mora, said, "Simon, it would be very good for you to actually, first of all, keep a journal. And secondly, practice writing some essays, maybe, of things that feelings that you're experiencing, and then you can bring an essay if you've got an issue, bring it with you to our next therapy session, and we can discuss that issue together and go over it. And it was the only thing that out of the three therapies, speech, OT, and PT, that I actually managed to achieve. In other words, I'd write a little essay, Maura would read it that day, and she'd say, "Good job, Simon. That was interesting what you said, and now let's talk about it." We'd talk about it. But I would leave that appointment at least feeling quite proud that I actually achieved something that that professional arm of the three said, gave me a pat on the back. Whereas the other two, the OT that I had to see and the PT, that gave me the homework to practice this particular movement with my arm or my walking technique or whatever it might be with the PT. I was failing miserably, and pretty much in every area of PT and OT, I was failing. And it was through that because, as a reasonably physically active guy as I was, playing tennis and golf and sailing and doing all sorts of stuff that I used to do, building things with my hands. I built an extension to my house on my own for my parents to visit with us. And, I was quite pleased with my physical prowess. I was getting much more frustrated and getting much more miserable as a result. And it was through these essays and letters of apologies, because I wrote lots of letters of apologies, Marcia, to PTs and OTs that I offended during the course of our sessions, being filterless, of course. When one certain OT, when I wrote a little poem to her as a form of apology for calling her a cow one day, she said, "Although it's not an apology, Simon, it was very nice. You ought to put that in a book," which really was the incentive for me, particularly on this last book, to write. And again, when the first book was published, obviously the captive audience was other stroke survivors, and being a party to many stroke groups that I was supporting at the time, you get the occasional stroke survivor said, "By the way, Simon, I read your book, absolutely loved it," and that made me feel really good too. And I think it's that sense of achievement, ego, obviously feeding the old ego, was what I found made me happy. And again, through writing and exploring what it was that made me happy with my writing, just made me want to write more. And then all of a sudden it morphed into a whole book. And then the second one came along and it was a little bit more precise. But and then from the books, university professor would say, "Would you like to come and speak to my SLP class of graduates that I'm training?" And then so I'd then get up in front of an audience and start talking about my experiences, largely that I had learned from my writing in the book. And then you get a round of applause, and then you feel really good for that. And all that stuff just continued to evolve and feed me, and it reinvented me. I managed to put away all the past, the past life that I used to have, and I've morphed and reinvented myself into the guy that's in front of you today.
That's awesome.
Largely as a result of keeping a journal, writing the occasional essay and letter of apology.
How long did it take you to realize that it's better to leave the old person behind and step into the new person?
It was probably about I would say year 4.
Yeah.
I was still under the illusion that I was going to be back to normal in no time at all. For the longest time, I think I'm a born again optimist, convinced that everything will be fine. Which is pretty much how I used to run my business, which is why my business didn't succeed in the end.
Yeah.
Because I went back to work, thinking that everything will be fine, and then I ran it into the ground, really, because I couldn't listen to anybody or advice, made bad decisions, and then the company went belly up. So that was at the same time as me failing in my physical therapy and occupational therapies. And so I was literally at rock bottom, and I'm speaking to other stroke survivors. In fact, that chap that in Oregon, who I think indicated to me that at one point he was actually suicidal.
Yep.
Or he felt very suicidal. And I think we all go through, I don't think anything that's happened to me is particularly unique at Marcia. I think that stroke survivors, first of all, they survived it. Lucky old us, we managed to survive, because some people don't, as well, and then we go through this wretched time, and if we're lucky, maybe our caregivers or our spouses or our loved ones stick with us and manage to keep us on the straight and narrow, get us to where we need to get to in the car, and feed us, and help us to get to the toilet and back, and so forth, and into bed. If we married well, like I did, then that helps us get through those really rotten times. And once you've been that low, and then you recognize that, well, I've now got to move on with what I've got. Acceptance, in other words, long answer to your question, I'm afraid, Marcia, but I find that once you've accepted it, then you can then start saying, well, listen, I still have this. I still have my right hand. I can still type with one hand. I can still talk. Some people are not as fortunate. So use those strengths with whatever it is that you want to do next. I can write, I can talk, and that can fill the voids that those previous activities used to provide. And you reinvent yourself. So, but I can't say that I just woke up with this epiphany. Oh, I'm going to go through this acceptance. It came on so gradually.
Yeah.
I would say almost weeks of being miserable and being quite nasty. It was only when I'm writing it down about how nasty I've become that it dawns on you, or dawned on me, that maybe I ought to change my goals, my what is it that I want out of life.
Why does stroke recovery rub you the wrong way?
Well, because I alluded to this in my last book. If you actually look up the word recovery, and as I did, the word recovery means literally to gain back something that you've lost. If you lose your wallet, you recover your wallet, you got it back in its entirety. And in medical terms, it actually means restoring yourself to a normal health, whatever normal means, I can't say. But what I've learned with stroke, and also not just my stroke, and everybody's stroke is different, as we all know, although it took me a long time to work that out, is that we really don't gain back what we had. In other words, people who, I have a friend up the road here, actually, who had a right brain stroke. You had a right brain, I think, Marcia, right?
Yep.
Right brain stroke. So he was probably like you. He was weak on his left side. Well, he was opposite to me. I mean, he persevered and worked really, really hard with his exercises and his homework from his occupational and physical therapists. And he wasn't going to be beaten by this thing. And he managed to get function with his bad side, his affected left side, to the extent that he could pick up things with his left hand. He could walk in the yard with a wheelbarrow, something I could never dream of doing. I mean, he's actually, but even when I asked him, I said, so if you were to compare it with where you were before the stroke, what would you say? 80%, 100%? He said, oh, no, 50. He never got it all back. So he hasn't recovered.
Yeah.
He's better than he was at the beginning of the stroke. And I think we do get better than we were at the beginning of the stroke, but we don't gain back what we had, where we were before. That's why I think recovery is a wrong word and shouldn't be used. It should be banned from the English language, from the SLP and the OT and the PT's languages.
If it's not recovery, do you have a different word?
Yes, discovery. Discovery is my word. discover what you can do, discover your new self, reinvent yourself. So it's a journey of discovery for me. I've learned a lot more about who I was before, who I am now, through my writing.
Mm-hmm.
And I've learned that I didn't particularly like the guy that I was before. I certainly didn't like the guy that I had morphed into immediately after the stroke, whereas I really like the guy I am now.
That's cool. What's the one thing you would leave brain injury survivors or their caretakers with knowing?
That the future is good. I did a little survey of stroke survivors in my acquaintance.
Mm-hmm.
It's a very basic survey, and it was something that I did for myself in looking at where I have been. These three different characters: him, the bloke before the stroke, as I call him. Then there was that guy, the guy that didn't know why, who was straight after the stroke. And then there's me 10 years post, still making the most. Those three completely different characters. And it was, I wanted to actually compare these three characters in terms of how happy I am. And came up with looking at all the character traits of the three individuals and what makes me happy. To conclude that I really am happier now than I was in the previous two characters. And I want to do the same with other stroke survivors. So I designed this little survey form, starting with the recovery question you just asked, as to where they feel, how they felt they are, and asked their caregivers also to help them answer the questions, to score their results of how their affected limbs are in comparison to where they were before the stroke. And barely anybody scored a higher number than 50% on the physical side. On the speaking side, your communication side, barely anybody scored anything over 50% on that as well. The only one area that they actually scored above 50%, somewhere between 50 and 80%, was in the area of optimism. Which was it. In other words, stroke survivors, once they've got through that rotten first couple of years, are generally optimistic, generally happy people, as happy now as they were before the stroke, because that's the whole point. It was a comparison with where they were before the stroke. And these are all obviously people that are post 36 months or longer. And even after 3 years, in some of these cases, I got results back that said, well, actually, I feel as good today as I did before the stroke in terms of the future.
Interesting.
So I don't believe. On the strength of my own personal experience and the experience of all these other stroke survivors I surveyed, my first thing I would say is it's not the end of the world. You don't need to be thinking yourself as a victim. Oh, woe is me.
Yep.
Please go. Make the most of what you've got. Love those that love you back around you, and go and do something good with yourself. And you can find it. It might not be writing in your case. It might be something else. But you can lead a good life. And those people, none of them were writers like me. But some of them actually did manage to get back to work. So, one of them, in fact, I was actually at a group meeting with him just yesterday, at Tuesday's back to work group meeting that I attend. This was a guy that's now gone back to lecturing in architecture at the local university here. Now, he acknowledges that no way can he lecture like he used to, but he's done it. He's admitted to his class that he has this slight communication issue, and to bear with him. They've accepted it, and he's happy with it at his slower pace, and he's enjoying life, just like he was before, or almost as much as he was before. So I think that the news of optimism is the first thing. And when I do these little talks, which is largely to SLPs, I target the SLPs particularly, and I target them because the SLP was really the only person out of the three professionals that was really the one that was relaying to me what was happening to me and what I was going to experience in the future and how hard it was going to be. So they were my source, my first source, and have been since, as to what to expect. So I think that's why I've targeted the SLPs, because that will be the same pretty much anywhere to any stroke survivor in the country, I assume. So to spread that message, and is what I wanted to do with the SLP. So I even say to the group of SLPs, if I do my job right today with my presentation, I expect each of you to leave this room nodding your head and saying to the person next to you, I need to go and get me one of them strokes. And I put on my best Alabama accent I need to get me one of them strokes, because he's obviously having a great time over there. And pass the message on. We are not victims. Life is good and life will get better.
Okay.
And we have every reason to enjoy life. And that's the message I'm trying to spread as best I can. Particularly,
You've given me a lot to think about, Simon. Thank you so much for being on Stroke Forward.
Marcia, the pleasure was all mine, darling. You let me talk for much too much, I'm sure. Sorry if I waffled a bit too much.
You did not waffle at all.
Bye-bye now.
Thank you for listening to Stroke Forward Podcast. If you enjoyed the podcast, please like it on Facebook, LinkedIn, or anywhere else you heard it. If you want a copy of Just Say Yes to Life, please order it from Amazon.com. The proceeds go to Stroke Awareness Oregon, an amazing nonprofit that educates about stroke causes, prevention, and treatment options. The book, Stroke Forward, is also available on Amazon.com.